So if you're talking about Longfellow's sonnets, it's pretty easy to divide them up into sort of an early, middle, late stage. The early sonnets, as we've talked about before, appear in his writings in the 40s and 50s. The middle sonnets are the poems of the 60s, and then the later sonnets are in the 70s. I want to talk about the middle sonnets today. The middle sonnets were, I think, kind of like the early sonnets, written not as a flurry of sonnet writing, like I'm in my sonnet phase. They were written for particular times and particular reasons. And he didn't write a lot of them in the 60s, but the 6 sonnets that he did write in the 60s form a sequence. And that sequence is called Divina Commedia. Now, why are they called Divina Commedia? Well, from around 1863 to around 1867, Longfellow was translating Dante's Divine Comedy. And what he decided to do as he published each volume of his translation, he wrote 2 sonnets as the front pieces for each of the sections. And so Divina Commedia 1 and 2 are the sonnets that were the prefaces to Inferno. 3 and 4 were the prefaces to Purgatorio, and 5 and 6 were the prefaces to Paradiso. So I want to read and highlight some of the themes that are coming out in the Divina Commedia sonnets. Now, we already saw that back in the 1840s, he had written a poem about Dante called Dante, which is about Dante in exile. And then, around the same time, he wrote the kind of secret sonnet that he didn't publish and did never publish in his lifetime, that his brother published later, called Mezzocammin, which is the opening phrase from Dante's Divine Comedy. So if you think, well, most of his sonnets are pretty Dante related, you're right. This would change a little bit in the later sonnets, but we'll talk about those in another video. Let's talk about the Divina Commedia sonnets. Divina Commedia 1. Oft have I seen at some cathedral door a laborer, pausing in the dust and heat, lay down his burden, and with reverent feet enter and cross himself, and on the floor kneel to repeat his Pater Noster, or far off the noises of the world retreat, the loud vociferations of the street become an undistinguishable roar. So, as I enter here from day to day, and leave my burden at this minster gate, kneeling in prayer, and not ashamed to pray, the tumult of the time disconsolate to inarticulate murmurs dies away, while the eternal ages watch and wait. This sonnet has so much fun things going on, and it's a pretty simple structure. There's this image, this is very Longfellow, where you have an image of a man doing something that then in the second half of the poem becomes, hey, I'm like him when I do this thing. And it's kind of a lesson about life, and often there's some encouragement in it. So we have this image of a laborer, a day laborer, maybe, a worker who walks past a cathedral and stops and enters and crosses himself and kneels and prays. And there's this sense that he's kind of letting the cares of the world fade away. We have these great words in the last 2 lines of the octave. The loud vociferations of the street become an undistinguishable roar. Longfellow had been writing poetry for 30 odd years by this point. And, he's kind of showing off with these. I can drop the word vociferations in, and it works with the iambic meter. So that's the octave that this guy comes. And, this is a European scene, I think, more than it's an American scene. And Longfellow, though he was an American, he was born in Maine. He lived his life mostly in Massachusetts, in and around Harvard University. He loved Europe and really liked illustrating scenes of daily life in Europe in both his poetry and his prose writing. And so this is sort of a scene from a contemporary laborer who goes into a cathedral. And then Longfellow says, that's like me. I enter here from day to day. Now, here is not a literal cathedral. Here is the cathedral-like space of Dante's Divine Comedy. He says, I leave my burden at the minster gate, kneeling in prayer and not ashamed to pray. The tumult of the time disconsolate to inarticulate murmurs dies away. while the eternal ages watch and wait. Anyone who had read, no, you couldn't have read Mesocomin in the early 1860s when he wrote this, but if you've read Mesocomin and then you see this poem, you think, oh, both have this image in the last line of sort of eternity, death, the great beyond, kind of being there and looming over him. Now, the cataract of death far thundering from the heights is more ominous than the eternal ages watch and wait. That's a little bit more inviting. In fact, it reminds me a little bit of him saying, I had this aspiration of my youth to build a lofty parapet of song. It seems like the eternal ages are like, oh, maybe he's going to do it now. Now, he's doing it not through his own composition, but through translation of the Divine Comedy. And he's kind of praying, and his translation is a prayer, and he's leaving a burden. Now, what is this burden? Well, this was written in the early 1860s. If you know anything about the early 1860s, America was in trouble. We were in the middle of a civil war. In fact, Longfellow's son was fighting on the front for a while in the Civil War, which Longfellow, though he was a staunch supporter of Lincoln, he was very worried for his son. So his activity of going to the comedy like a cathedral and praying, it's a way of saying, I'm going to put that to the side, all my worries to the side. And by this time, when he wrote this poem, I think his wife had died, his second wife, very tragic. And so that we have a whole video on Longfellow's love life that you should go watch if you're interested in that. But when he says, the tumult of the time disconsolate, leave my burden, these are real disconsolations and real burdens. This man was, I think, probably if he had seen a psychiatrist, they would have said, sir, you are profoundly and deeply disturbed and depressed. And he knows it. And so he throws himself into the Divine Comedy. So this poem, while it might seem kind of quiet and nice and peaceful, I think it's a feat of self-possession, among other things. The second sonnet, I won't read all of these sonnets, but let's look at the second sonnet. How strange the sculptures that adorn these towers, this crowd of statues in whose folded sleeves birds build their nests, while canopied with leaves, parvis and portal bloom like trellised bowers, and the vast minster seems a cross of flowers. But fiends and dragons on the gargoyled eaves watch the dead Christ between the living thieves, and underneath the traitor Judas lowers. Ah, from what agonies of heart and brain, what exultations trampling on despair, what tenderness, what tears, what hate of wrong, what passionate outcry of a soul in pain uprose this poem of the earth and air, this medieval miracle of song. Ah, I love it. The octave, I think once again, we see in these octaves this Longfellow's remembering what it's like to be in a cathedral in Europe. And he's like, oh, there's the parvis and the portal and, the fiends and gargoyles and, these biblical scenes. He loves describing them. And this is something that sometimes drove Longfellow's detractors nuts. It's like he gets lost in his memories of Europe and you're like, Longfellow, come back, dude. But oh my gosh, he comes back with a vengeance in the sestet. From what agonies of heart and brain, what exultations trampling on despair. We saw Dante in exile in that Dante poem, but I think here we have this. Longfellow's like, hey guys, I'm kind of feeling it right now. And so I'm just going to kind of pour out like, he's having a hard time. He's having agony. He's having, despair. And yet he's triumphing over it through this creative act. And there's a lot of intertextual things going on that maybe literary critics could be interested in here. But Longfellow is doing a little bit of identification with Dante and trying to insist not on his own, like, I'm having a hard time, guys, but on, hey, Dante wrote these things, made this cathedral with these scenes. He made it not because he was a stodgy old medieval who had nothing better to do, but from raw and real pain and self-crafting and worship too. This isn't just I need to put my pain into words, but I want a poem of the earth and air, and that air doesn't just mean the atmosphere. The heavens are the goal and the vision of Dante in his poem, and we even have this very hyperbolic. It's a medieval miracle of song. Also, medieval miracle is nice to say. Once again, Longfellow is enjoying these multisyllabic words that he's throwing together. The third and fourth sonnets kind of continue the cathedral theme and then slowly move away from it. So in the third one, it's kind of a recapitulation of the first. Like, I enter here from day to day. This is my work. I'm hearing sort of these pronouncements of forgiveness. There's a forgiveness theme that comes into the Purgatorio sonnets. I want to read you the fourth sonnet, which is the second Purgatorio sonnet. It's probably my favorite. With snow white veil and garments as of flame, she stands before thee, who so long ago filled thy young heart with passion and the woe from which thy song and all its splendors came. And while with stern rebuke she speaks thy name, the ice about thy heart melts as the snow on mountain heights, and in swift overflow comes gushing from thy lips in sobs of shame. Thou makest full confession, and a gleam as of the dawn on some dark forest cast seems on thy lifted forehead to increase. Lethe and Eunoe, the remembered dream and the forgotten sorrow, bring at last that perfect pardon, which is perfect peace. All of a sudden, we're not in the cathedral anymore like we were in the first three sonnets. We're all of a sudden with she and thee. Now, readers of Dante's Purgatorio will know that this she and thee is the scene of Dante, the pilgrim, who has climbed through the horrors of hell and climbed up the difficult slopes of Mount Purgatory and meets finally his beloved Beatrice at the top. And so Beatrice and Dante are standing across from each other. They meet with a river in between them, very symbolic here. She stands before thee, who so long ago filled thy young heart with passion. And with stern rebuke, she speaks thy name. So this isn't a meet cute. This isn't I've missed you. It's hey, you got some splaining to do, buddy. And the pilgrim, the you, Dante, he doesn't start defending himself. He is castigated by Beatrice, and it purifies him. The ice about thy heart melts as the snow on mountain heights. It comes gushing from thy lips in sobs of shame. Thou makest full confession. So this is like a melting purification, confession, reconciliation. We have this idea of the sacrament of confession that would take place in cathedrals, but this, once again, isn't now in a cathedral. It's at the top of Mount Purgatory. And we have this idea that the dawn has come to the dark forest. The dark forest, that was back at the beginning of Inferno. Midway upon the journey of this life, I woke to find myself in a dark wood, famously. He says, now dawn has come to the dark forest. And we have this achievement of perfect pardon, which is perfect peace. And it's interesting, and I've written on this before, actually. One of the first book chapters I ever published was about the ending of sonnets. And it's interesting that back in 1845, Dante says at the end of the Dante sonnet, I'm looking for peace. He says, someone asked the pilgrim what he seeks, and his voice along the cloisters whispers, peace. Peace was asked for in 1845. Here, around 1865, we have the achievement of peace by the pilgrim, the perfect pardon, which is perfect peace. And I like to think that maybe Longfellow is showing, hey, there was a lot of turmoil and, pushing through pain for achievement in the earlier Divina Commedia sonnets. Now where there's a little bit more of settling, reconciliation, peace, which, I don't know, I think it shows good development. I don't know what it's like to translate the whole Divine Comedy, but it's got to be pretty difficult and pretty rewarding, I would think, both artistic journey and spiritual journey. 5 and 6 were the last two Divina Commedia sonnets. They were published in 1867 as the front pieces of Paradiso. Let's look at the last one. O star of morning and of liberty, O bringer of light, whose splendor shines above the darkness of the Apennines, forerunner of the day that is to be. The voices of the city and the sea, the voices of the mountains and the pines, repeat thy song, till the familiar lines are footpaths for the thought of Italy. Thy fame is blown abroad from all the heights, through all the nations, and a sound is heard as of a mighty wind, and men devout, strangers of Rome and new proselytes, in their own language hear thy wondrous word, and many are amazed, and many doubt. It's interesting, in the octave of this, we get this idea of Dante is a star of morning and liberty. He shines out the Apennines, the mountains of Italy, the pines, the city, the sea. They're all reverberating with Dante's song. And thy fame is blown abroad from all the heights, through all the nations. So it starts in Italy, but it goes out. And then it becomes a mighty wind. And man, Longfellow is so good. And Longfellow knows his Bible, and he knows his literature. And so he's able to move from Dante's song is moving throughout the world from Italy. But then all of a sudden we're in the early scene in the book of Acts, which if you read the book of Acts, you have the Pentecost scene where there's a sound like a mighty rushing wind and flames appear on the heads of Christ's disciples. And they go out and preach the gospel to all the people gathered there, strangers from Rome and new proselytes. That's a phrase from Acts 2, I believe. So all of a sudden, Dante's message, Dante's poetry becomes like a new Pentecost. And this is so good. And in their own language, hear thy wondrous word. Dante even wrote a whole treatise called De Vulgari Eloquentia about how it's important to write poetry in the language of the people. The language that they didn't have to learn from books or in school, but the language that they spoke from their infancy, that they knew by heart. In their own language, hear thy wondrous word. If that was all, it would be interesting. It was good, that we have this vernacular term in medieval literature, but these words are actually from Acts, where one of the miracles that takes place at Pentecost is when the apostles preach, everyone hears them preaching the good news about Jesus Christ in their own native languages. There's a sort of vernacular turn miraculously that happens in Acts 2. And so he weaves these images together so well. But this last line is so good because there's an ambivalence to it. And many are amazed and many doubt. And that too is a line from Acts. Longfellow knows, I can praise this song. I can, give this great Christian vision of the poem as cathedral and this medieval miracle. But, the whole world is going to receive it, and many will be amazed and many will doubt. And he leaves that tension open for us. So in these middle sonnets in the 1860s, we see Longfellow throwing himself into translation work, writing some of the best and most complex sonnets of his career, and really striving and kind of comparing himself, I don't think in a bad way, to Dante, and realizing there's a lot of affinities. And he himself has to reckon with the message of Dante. He's a 19th century Unitarian American. He doesn't believe all the same things Dante believed. He doesn't live in the same culture, same age, doesn't have the same, even beliefs about Christianity. And yet he is helped by translating, and he has to kind of reckon with the Dantean vision of the world. And out of it comes these great sonnets. Thanks for hanging out. We're going to do one more video. I know we're spending a lot of time on Longfellow, but I love it. We're going to do one more video on the late sonnets next time. Thanks.